nearly 800,000 Americans woke up without a voice in Congress, not because of a scandal, not because of a vote recount, but because one man said no. Speaker of the House Mike Johnson blocked a duly elected Democrat from taking office, and the fallout just triggered one of the most brutal courtroom rulings in recent political history. A federal judge didn't just disagree with Johnson, he obliterated his authority. The language used in the ruling wasn't cautious, it was scathing. Words like flagrant abuse of authority and constitutionally indefensible now haunt Johnson's leadership. This wasn't just a legal defeat. It was a public political meltdown, and it's tearing the MAGA movement apart from the inside. Allies are turning, critics are circling, the chaos has only just begun. But here's the real shocker. This wasn't a gray area or legal loophole, according to experts, even conservative ones. Johnson never had the authority in the first place, so why did he do it? And what happens now? We pour countless hours into crafting these deep dive videos for you. So if you learned something new or saw a side of the story you've never heard before, leave us a comment with your thoughts. And if you want to support this kind of honest, no fluff storytelling, please subscribe. It's just one click, but it means everything to us. When federal judges issue rulings, they're usually measured, careful, and restrained, but not this time. In a rare move, the court came down on Speaker Mike Johnson with full force, using language that was shockingly blunt. The ruling didn't just say Johnson was wrong. It accused him of crossing a constitutional red line. Words like constitutionally indefensible and flagrant abuse of authority are not common in federal opinions. That's the kind of legal condemnation reserved for the most reckless political overreach. This wasn't about a technical error or a misstep. The judge made it clear. Johnson deliberately bypassed established procedures that have governed the House for over 200 years. No committee review, no vote, no debate, just a unilateral decision to block a duly elected Democrat from being sworn in. The court emphasized that this was not just illegal, it was intentional. That word matters. Intent implies a willful abuse of power, not a misunderstanding of the rules. And once intent is proven, the consequences become far more severe. The result, not just a legal loss, but a total collapse of credibility. This wasn't a situation Johnson could spin or walk away from quietly. The court's language left no room for excuses. And for a political leader who built his image as a disciplined, law-respecting conservative, the blow was personal and deeply damaging. His image as a strong MAGA defender cracked in real time. When a federal judge says your decision directly harmed hundreds of thousands of voters for partisan advantage, it's more than just bad optics. It's a scar that sticks. And that's exactly what's happening. The MAGA movement didn't just lose in court. It watched one of its key figures get publicly dismantled, with every word of that ruling now echoing through headlines, social media, and even within his own party. The moment the ruling hit the public, the MAGA movement did something it rarely does. It turned on itself. Instead of rallying behind Speaker Mike Johnson, the base split into two furious camps. One side went into attack mode, blasting the judge as a deep state puppet and calling the ruling a left-wing ambush. On social media and MAGA-friendly platforms, cries of judicial tyranny and weaponized courts exploded overnight. This faction demanded open defiance, urging Johnson to ignore the ruling entirely. To them, surrendering would be worse than losing, but there was a problem. Johnson had already lost, and badly. The other camp wasn't shouting at the court. They were pointing their fingers at Johnson himself. They didn't see a victim. They saw weakness. This faction argued that Johnson had failed them, not because he stood firm, but because he allowed the situation to reach a courtroom at all. They expected him to be strategic, to stay one step ahead of legal traps. Instead, they got a high-profile defeat that handed ammunition to their political enemies. Some even went as far as calling him a liability, a dangerous word in MAGA circles, where loyalty depends entirely on strength and results. This internal split is devastating for a movement that thrives on shared outrage and collective direction. MAGA isn't built to absorb internal blame. It's structured around targeting external enemies. Judges, Democrats, the media. But this case forced a different kind of reckoning. When a leader fails so publicly and the loss can be blamed on outsiders, the movement fragments fast. The moment the base starts debating who's responsible instead of who to attack, momentum dies. That's exactly what happened here, and it's why this ruling hit so much deeper than a normal political setback. This wasn't just a power struggle in Washington, it was a direct hit on American representation. When Speaker Mike Johnson blocked the swearing in of a duly elected Democratic representative, the impact was immediate, massive. Almost 800,000 citizens were left without a voice in Congress, no vote on legislation, no input on federal funding, no advocate to represent them in the decisions that shape their daily lives. This didn't happen because of voter fraud, recounts, or a contested certification. It happened because one man decided it was politically inconvenient to seat the winner. The court saw through it instantly. That's why the judge treated the case with such urgency and severity. Representation isn't just a tradition, it's the foundation of democracy. Every day that seat empty meant real consequences, missed votes, stalled funding, and silenced voices on key issues like healthcare, taxes, and infrastructure. The judge didn't view this as an abstract debate between lawmakers. He saw it for what it was. A violation of the rights of nearly 1 million voters, all because of partisan calculation. And here's where it became even more explosive. Once the public realized this wasn't about Johnson's authority, but about voters being erased, the tide of sympathy turned immediately. Even people outside partisan lines understood the danger of letting a single politician override election results. It reframed the story from political strategy to democratic betrayal. And in that moment, Johnson wasn't just a speaker under fire. He became the face of a systemic threat to voter power. That's a label no politician wants, and it's one that sticks far longer than a legal loss. One of the most damaging parts of the ruling wasn't just the verdict, it was the court's conclusion about why Mike Johnson acted. According to the judge, this wasn't about safeguarding election integrity or protecting the constitutional process. It was about preserving Republican control in a closely divided House. In plain terms, the Speaker tried to block a Democrat from being seated to manipulate the vote count. That motive, laid out clearly and backed by legal evidence, destroyed every talking point MAGA leaders had prepared. This wasn't a partisan smear. The court relied on facts, procedure, and constitutional law, and what it found was devastating. Johnson didn't misinterpret the law, he ignored it for political gain. That turned what could have been defended as a controversial interpretation into something far worse, a strategic abuse of power. Once the court established that Johnson's intent was to interfere with legislative balance, the entire story flipped. This wasn't about defending democracy, it was about rigging it from the inside. For a movement like MAGA, which built its identity around fighting election manipulation and exposing rigged systems, this reversal was unbearable. Suddenly, the judge wasn't accusing the system of being biased against conservatives. He was accusing a conservative leader of trying to tilt the system himself. That kind of contradiction is impossible to walk back. You can argue about fairness, you can argue about process, but once intent to manipulate power is proven in court, even your own supporters begin to question everything. That's what happened here. And that's why MAGA didn't just lose a court case, it lost a cornerstone of its own narrative. In most political movements, loyalty is a two-way street. You stand by your leaders, and in return, they stand by you when things go wrong. But in the MAGA world, that loyalty is brutally conditional. As long as you're winning, you're praised as a fighter. The moment you lose, you're expendable. Mike Johnson learned that the hard way. The same voices that once celebrated him as a disciplined, God-fearing enforcer of the MAGA agenda suddenly began questioning his value, his strength, and even his position as speaker. This wasn't just some angry chatter online. It spread quickly through MAGA-aligned influencers, right-wing podcasts, and political donors. Instead of rallying around a wounded leader, the movement started asking, "Why did you lose?" Not was the ruling fair, not was this fight worth it. Just why did you fail us? That single, ruthless question has taken down bigger names than Johnson before, and in MAGA's cutthroat world, failure is treated like betrayal. And that's what makes this courtroom loss far more dangerous than a typical political setback. It didn't just weaken Johnson in the eyes of Democrats or independents. It shattered the illusion of strength he needed to maintain control. MAGA doesn't reward effort, it rewards dominance. And when a leader can no longer deliver wins, the knives come out. Johnson didn't just lose a legal case, he failed a loyalty test with no right answer. Obey the ruling and appear weak, defy it and trigger chaos. Either way, his status as a trusted fighter is gone. And just in a movement built on winning at all costs, that kind of damage is nearly impossible to recover from. What made this defeat even more catastrophic was how Mike Johnson tried to pull it off. Instead of following centuries-old procedures used by the House of Representatives, he made the decision alone. No vote, no committee, no debate. He simply declared that a duly elected member would not be seated, as if the Speaker's gavel gave him unlimited power over democracy itself. That wasn't just bold, it was reckless, and the court wasted no time tearing it down. The Constitution is crystal clear on this. The power to judge elections and seat members belongs to the full House, not the Speaker acting alone. Johnson's legal team tried to argue that the past precedent gave him wide discretion, but the judge wasn't buying it. The ruling emphasized that skipping procedures isn't some fast-track solution. It's a violation of democratic principles. When representation is on the line, every step matters, and Johnson ignored them all. This miscalculation didn't just lead to a legal defeat. It handed Johnson's critics their strongest argument yet. By bypassing the system, he didn't just break the rules, he exposed himself as a leader who was willing to silence voters for political gain. And in doing so, he gave MAGA's enemies a weapon, undeniable proof that their side was willing to undermine the Constitution to hold power. That's not a spin. That's not media bias. That's now case law. Johnson thought he could outmaneuver the system and walk away untouched. Instead, he walked straight into a courtroom disaster that shattered not only his authority, but the entire tactic MAGA hoped to use again. One of the most embarrassing aspects of this defeat, Mike Johnson was warned, and not by Democrats. Even conservative constitutional scholars, many of whom regularly defend Republican policies, made it clear this legal strategy was doomed from the start. They publicly stated that the Speaker of the House does not have the authority to block a duly elected member without going through proper procedures. These weren't fringe voices. They were respected legal minds who wanted Johnson to succeed, but knew the Constitution would not back him up. Johnson chose to ignore those warnings. He pushed forward anyway, betting on political momentum rather than legal reality. That decision turned a potential fight into a predictable disaster. The court's rejection of his argument wasn't a surprise. It was inevitable, and that changes the narrative completely. This wasn't a bold miscalculation or an unexpected ruling. It was a self-inflicted wound, one that legal experts across the spectrum had already predicted. That makes the fallout even worse. MAGA leaders cannot say the court was unfair when their own allies admitted the case had no legal foundation. There's no shield of victimhood here, only recklessness. For a movement that thrives on claiming it's being targeted unfairly, this loss offers no such cover. It was a failure of judgment, planning, and leadership. And when that realization sinks in, support doesn't just fade, it vanishes. Johnson didn't just lose in court, he lost the benefit of the doubt, even from the people who once stood in his corner. At the heart of this case was a dangerous assumption that the Speaker of the House could act like a gatekeeper of democracy, deciding who gets seated and who doesn't, with no oversight. Mike Johnson tried to wield that kind of authority, but the court's ruling made one thing crystal clear. The Speaker is not a king. He cannot rewrite constitutional rules to fit political goals. And more importantly, he is not above judicial review. Had Johnson won, the implications would have been staggering. It would have set a precedent allowing future speakers Democrat or Republican, to delay or deny representation simply because they didn't like the election outcome. Elections would have become suggestions, and power in Congress could be manipulated at will. That's not just dangerous, that's the blueprint for constitutional breakdown. Thankfully, the judge understood that threat and slammed the door shut before it could be normalized. This wasn't just a courtroom decision, it was a course correction for democracy. By declaring Johnson's move unconstitutional, the court reaffirmed limits on political power, especially when that power threatens the foundational idea of voter representation. And for a movement like MAGA, which increasingly relies on procedural hardball and power grabs to hold influence in a deeply divided Congress, the message was chilling. There are still rules, and the courts are still willing to enforce them. For those hoping to push the boundaries of authority even further, this case didn't just stop them. It rewrote the playbook, removing a key tactic from their arsenal. For years, the MAGA movement has thrived on a strategy of pushing limits, testing procedures, bending norms, and using institutional chaos to its advantage. But this time, that strategy didn't just fail. It backfired in front of the entire country. Mike Johnson's move was supposed to be a demonstration of strength, a bold maneuver to protect the party's razor-thin margin in the House. Instead, it turned into a legal embarrassment that exposed the boundaries of their playbook. The court didn't just rule on Johnson's actions, it defined the future by stating clearly that no speaker has the authority to deny a member their seat without due process. The judge set a precedent that narrows MAGA's tactical options moving forward. That's a serious blow to a movement that has depended on aggressive procedural stunts to maintain control without the ability to stretch rules to the breaking point. MAGA is being forced to play by the same standards it once dismissed as obsolete. And that's what has MAGA World truly panicking. Not just the loss itself, but the realization that their favorite tool is no longer available. If Johnson's stunt had succeeded, it would have opened the door for future speakers to block opposition lawmakers at will. But now that door has been slammed shut, and the courts made it clear they're watching. For a movement that thrives on disruption and dominance, being told no by the Constitution hits harder than any political attack. The game has changed, and they know it. What makes this courtroom loss truly devastating is that it didn't just damage Mike Johnson's legal standing. It ignited a political identity crisis inside MAGA itself. Instead of uniting around their speaker, influential voices on the right began asking a dangerous question: should Johnson be replaced? That kind of talk isn't normal after one court ruling, but this wasn't a normal case. The defeat hit so hard and cut so deep that it shattered the illusion of Johnson's strength overnight. In MAGA circles, winning isn't just expected, it's everything. Johnson did what was expected of him. He blocked opposition, projected control, and stuck to the playbook. But once he lost in court, none of that mattered. MAGA loyalty isn't based on process, reason, or law. It's based on results. And when those results disappear, so does the support. Suddenly the speaker who once seemed untouchable became a political liability, openly criticized by the very people who once praised his discipline. This is how movements unravel, not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of cracks that expose the fragility of power built on fear and dominance. When Johnson failed, the base didn't ask whether the court was right. They didn't ask whether the law made this unavoidable. They asked the only question that matters in MAGA politics: why did you lose? And that question alone is enough to end a leadership career. Johnson didn't just lose a case. He lost the one thing every MAGA leader needs to survive: the appearance of strength. Without that, no title, no loyalty, and no legacy can save him.